Welcome to the EmberG Bootcamp. Thank you so much for enrolling. I'm so excited to finally be able to present this course to you. If this is the very first time that you're learning with me, then welcome again. My name is Jesse Patella and I run the Redefine FX website and the YouTube channel. We have a lot to cover in this course. However, there's nothing to be intimidated by. I'm gonna walk you through everything step by step. There's a lot of pretty cool examples that come along with the course. And like I always say, just relax into it. There's nothing to be nervous about or stressed about. We're going to have a good time setting up some pretty cool simulations that, because of the speed of EmberG, literally within 5 minutes, you're going to have a cool result that you can post on Twitter, Instagram, ArtStation, Discord, and start attracting new opportunities, improve your show reel, and really just level up your skills when it comes to volumetric and particle effects. We're gonna touch on all of the main features, but again, we're gonna take it super easy from the beginning. We need to get through the introductory chapter. I definitely recommend that you stick around for the very first chapter that you're inside of right now. We're gonna cover some essential shortcuts, the interface, linking the notes. We're going to build a scene from scratch with nothing being here so that you really have an understanding of how all of these nodes work and how they connect together, because that's what's going to ultimately allow you to create original effects that you may be asked to do at a studio from your creative director, VFX supervisor, boss, whatever it might be. It's only through truly understanding software that you'll be able to make your own stuff, instead of just, trying to replicate an effect. If you've been following me for a while, you know that I try to keep the lessons short and sweet, get to the point. They're usually between 5 to 10 minutes, so you can watch a few of them every day and really learn a lot in a short period of time. I'm always going to be sharing as many tips and tricks as I can to help you in your journey. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into it. So make sure you have your EmberG fired up, and I'll see you in the next video. Okay, so I just want to briefly touch on hardware recommendations. So EmberG will use 100% of your graphics card power, and it runs almost entirely on just your graphics card. So this is one of those instances where having a better graphics card will visibly right away give you faster performance. This is one of those softwares where the better the graphics card, the better off you truly are. For example, I'm on a 64-core Threadripper, and not every application is able to use all of the cores. However, with EmberG, it will use 100% of your graphics card. So right now the GPU load is at 94%. If this was a heavier simulation, this would be at 99%. So I'm using this handy software called NZXT Cam. You can download it over here. Just search NZXT Cam on Google. You can download it for free. It's a great way to keep an eye on all the temperatures. I just keep it on my second monitor at all times. Another good thing to have is a fast SSD, like the fastest you can get. Again, the faster the better, because especially when it comes time to start exporting stuff into VDBs, the process of writing the VDB files onto your drive can take a while. So this is definitely one of those moments where having a fast drive truly makes a difference. So I am right now on a 4090 RTX. That's what I'll be using to record the entire course. I have successfully used EmberG in the past on a 3090 RTX as well as a 2080, and it still ran smooth as butter. Of course, it's faster on a newer graphics card, but even if you have an older card, it's definitely not a reason to not use EmberG. You'll still be able to follow along. So, don't be discouraged if you have an older graphics card. You're still good to go. You're still gonna have a good time. So I would say a 1080 I would consider to be the bare minimum. Preferably you're on maybe a 2070 or a 2080. That's gonna give you a really smooth performance. I think that's all when it comes to hardware. It's really all about your GPU, and we're gonna continue in the next video. Alright, I wanted to make this quick video before we jump into EmberG to really talk a little bit about mindset and sort of get your mind right about how to approach learning a new software and learning visual effects in general. Really, at the end of the day, it's about preparing yourself for that situation in the real world where somebody's gonna ask you for something that there is no preset for and there is no tutorial for, right? I can tell you that I used to be a tutorial and project file hoarder. When I was a teenager, I had a hard drive full of free tutorials and project files, and yet my career wasn't improving and I wasn't really getting anywhere. And then what happens is VFX supervisors and clients have a way of asking for something that hasn't been done before. Or they have very particular requests, such as, can you make the smoke dissipate faster? Can you make the fire rise faster? Can you add more particles here? Unless you know how the software works from the ground up, you are gonna panic because you're gonna realize, oh my God, I don't know what to do. All I have is a bunch of presets, but there's no preset for what they're asking for. You go on YouTube, there's no tutorial for exactly what the client wants, and you're eventually gonna go back to this moment and realize, you know what, instead of always looking for a shortcut, always looking for a quick preset or a quick flashy YouTube tutorial for like a Thanos portal on YouTube, I should have spent the time to just learn the software properly from the beginning so that when the challenges arise, I know what the settings do. I know how to adjust the simulations exactly how the client wants it in a few minutes without having to go through 100 presets. You know, just by taking this course, that's already a great first step because I spent a lot of time on this course. I tried to make it as valuable as I could, and I really think it's gonna help you. Like, I'm very confident about this course. And the way I would like you to approach the learning is, I'm not just trying to replicate a cool effect that Jesse made. I'm trying to learn from his techniques, and I'm trying to pay attention to the workflows and the techniques that he's using that I can use in my own work, right? That's what this is really about. Of course, I tried to make this course as cool as I could and include some very cool examples because I want this course to be engaging and get people excited. But at the end of the day, it's about the techniques that you are then gonna use for your own work at a job, at a studio. So I am gonna say this multiple times throughout the course, but even if a particular effect doesn't interest you, it's more about watching it to learn about how it's put together, how the emitters work, what settings I'm using, and paying attention to the techniques rather than trying to replicate a particular cool effect, right? Because there's always gonna be cool 5 to 10 minute tutorials popping up on YouTube, and I make them too. Right? That's how I grow my YouTube channel. But at the end of the day, for people who want to really learn from the ground up, that's why you take a course like this bootcamp, to take it from the bottom to the top and learn how all of these settings work together to then craft your own stuff. Right? So I would say have an attitude of curiosity. Be curious about what the settings do and how they work. And always try to think to yourself, okay, you know, Jesse just showed me how to make this particular shockwave. How can I maybe change the settings a little bit based on what I've already learned earlier in the course to make this look like a big meteor hit, or instead like a very small anime style shockwave, or whatever it is that you're into. Always try to apply the knowledge as soon as you learn it. So when you first load up EmberG, this is the home screen that you should be seeing. If instead you're seeing the default fire simulation that looks like this, you can just pause it by hitting spacebar and then click on the home icon over here to get back to the home page. So in the top row, you'll see your recent projects. Then you have 3 default presets here for default smoke, default fire, and default explosion. And then some updates from the Jenga Effects YouTube channel show up here. So I just want to show you the default presets. We have the default explosion, which looks like this. You can hit R to reset the simulation, and I'll just click and hold my left mouse button to orbit around the explosion. You can go back to the home screen and select the default fire, which looks like this. Middle mouse button to zoom in, left mouse button, click, hold, and drag the mouse to orbit around. And then finally you have the default smoke, which looks like this. Next, you have the Learn tab, which has some introductory tutorials, also the live streams from the Jenga Effects YouTube channel. And then, of course, you have all of the presets that come along with EmberG. Quick tip, you can just search for whatever you're looking for. So if you need wispy smoke, you can just type in wispy and you'll get just that. Or you can just type in explosion and just get all the explosions. You can also filter everything by some of these pre-made filters. So you can just show all of the fire simulations, smoke, explosions, magic, particles, and then you can also filter by the amount of VRAM. So if you have an older graphics card, you might want to only use presets that only use up to 8 gigs of VRAM, which are these. If you have a newer graphics card, I would say 3090 or 4090, then you can use the 24 gig presets as well. Be careful with this. If you try to open a 24 gig preset on an older graphics card that doesn't actually have 24 gigs of VRAM, it will very likely crash EmberG for you. So I'm gonna click on all again to show all of the presets. Now I wanna touch on presets for a little bit because I know a lot of people look at these as the magic pill, but I think if you're actually new to a software, then the presets don't do you that much good. That was really the whole reason I think why you enrolled in a course, is because you know that it's important to understand the software so that you can create your own preset from scratch. Because if you've never opened EmberG and you look at something like this and then the director says, we need the explosion to dissipate faster, the flames to last longer, we need more detail, and we need it to look larger scale, it looks too small scale, you don't really know what to do, right? At some point you still have to go in and start to dissect all of these settings and all of these nodes to figure out how this blast is actually put together from scratch. Like if there was nothing here, now what do I do? How do I get that explosion to go from this to that big blast that I had? I would actually say that presets are helpful once you are more of an advanced user, right? So the reason why I'm telling you this is because I think it's important for us to know why we're gonna set up these simulations completely from scratch. Like, yes, there might be a template or a preset for an explosion that looks really cool, but unless I know step by step how something like this is put together and I'm confident that I can recreate something like this on my own, then I'm gonna struggle in a real production environment. However, with all of that said, the presets are still very interesting and I would still encourage you to open every single one of them. And what you can do at the very least is maybe just turn off some of these on and off so you can see what kind of effect the different forces have. Maybe there's some particles, so you can turn off the particles and just see roughly how things are put together. However, we're gonna touch on all of these settings and features throughout the course, so you can just follow along with me and not worry about the presets too much. So the final tab over here are my projects, pretty self-explanatory. Then we have some link to the official Jenga Effects Discord, which I recommend that you join. Lots of very helpful stuff being shared over there, as well as the official forum. Right, so I just wanted to cover the home screen and show you everything that's here, especially the search feature and the filters over here. And we're gonna continue in the next video. Okay, so we can make a new project by clicking over here, new project, and this is the default fire simulation that comes with EmberG. Let's finish going over the navigation. So again, left mouse button and drag, you can rotate around. Right mouse button, you can just pan the camera. Then if you hold Control, click left mouse button and move the mouse, you can just very slowly and precisely zoom in and out. And if you hold the right mouse button, then you can do W, S, D, A, just like you're inside of a game. You can do Q to go down and E to go up. And of course, you can just rotate the wheel on your mouse to move forward and backward. You can hit spacebar to pause the simulation. And when you're running the simulation, your GPU can be used up to 100%, but just watch when I pause the simulation, it drops all the way down to maybe 30%. So this is a great way to quickly get your power back, so to speak. If you need your GPU for something else, just pause the simulation with spacebar and you're good to go. Another essential shortcut is B. So that's B as a box, which hides the simulation box area highlight. Next one is Z. Z as in zebra. You can just keep clicking Z to go 1 frame forward. You can just hold Z to slowly simulate forward. And one more useful one is Control Spacebar, which makes the window go full screen. This is helpful when you're recording your screen to show off your simulations online. You can just do Control Spacebar to maximize and then minimize again your window. When it comes to all of these notes, we're gonna go over all of them. Don't worry about it right now. Just want you to be aware that Jenga FX added some basic comments here that tell you what some of these notes do. You can just delete the comment and then you can make a new comment by selecting the notes and just Control G. So that's Control G to make a new comment, name it whatever you would like, and move all of the notes at once. So I'll just delete it again. Now, if all of your notes are a bit messy, you can just select them all and Alt A. So that's A for align. So Alt A to nicely align all of the notes. So we're gonna keep going over the shortcuts throughout the course. I will keep repeating these essential ones and also keep adding new ones. If you'd like to see a list of all of the shortcuts that are available inside of EmberG, you can go under Settings, Preferences, Shortcuts, and here's a nice list of all of the shortcuts that are currently available. Now you can also add your own shortcut by clicking the plus sign over here and then just assigning the key that you want. So for example, if you're used to a different shortcut to move, scale, and rotate, maybe if you work in 3ds Max, then EmberG is gonna drive you crazy because in 3ds Max it's actually W to move, while here it's W to rotate. So you can just change it over here to make your life easier if you're coming from a different software. So you have 4 main windows that you'll be dealing with: the scene window, the timeline, the node details, and the node graph. Now you might be used to working from left to right instead of right to left. So what you can do is just click on these 6 dots over here and you can just move the entire window to the other side and just dock it to the right. And you can just maybe move the node details over here. You can maybe move the timeline down here so you get something more like Adobe Premiere. So you have your notes, you have the note settings over here, and you can work on this side. I just want you to be aware you can customize the interface however you would like. So I'll just move this back the way it was before. So just to finish going over the essential shortcuts, let's go over the transform. So you can just select the primitive and you can of course freely move it. You can hit Q to move, W to rotate, and E to scale it up and down. Now if you mess up, you can just go over here into the settings and you can click on this arrow to reset it back to the default value. You can also click on view over here to control what's actually shown in the viewport. So I can enable the manipulator switcher, and here I have the transform control. So I have move, rotate, scale easily accessible over here. I can also show my camera gizmo. This is very useful so that you actually know which axis you're looking at. Then you can hit Shift S to show the stats over here. This shows you how many particles you have in the scene. It's 0 right now. How much VRAM you're using. What's the frame rate of the UI. And then the render and simulation time and the resolution of the current viewport that is being rendered. So you can see this number is reacting to me scaling the viewport up and down. Right, this is not your export resolution. This is just the resolution of the current viewport right here. So this is enough for this first video. Just to recap, it's spacebar to pause the simulation. It's control spacebar to go full screen. B to hide or unhide the simulation box. Z to go 1 frame forward. It's Q to move, W to rotate, E to scale. Then it's Control G to make a new comment. And if you select all of them, you can do Alt A to align all of the notes. And we will continue in the next video. Okay, so in this video, we're actually gonna start with a completely blank scene and create some basic fire from scratch. So it actually gives you some basic steps that you need to take to get something going. But we know that we want to set an object on fire. So to create anything, you can just right click inside of the node graph and you get a menu of all of the different objects and nodes that you can create inside of EmberG. So we need a shape that we're gonna set on fire, and I'll just create a shape primitive. You can scroll the wheel to zoom in. So right now there is a sphere inside of the scene, but we need to turn it into an emitter, which will actually emit some fuel, which we can set on fire. So I'll just drag out of this, and it gives me options for all the different nodes that can be connected to the shape, right? So you have a choice. You can either right click, go to emitter and create an emitter manually, or you can just drag directly from the node and it'll give you a reduced list of only the stuff that's allowed to be plugged in here. So I want to create an emitter volume. I can go into the node details to see all of the settings. I can either quickly switch between the different tabs, or you can just keep scrolling. It's all just one big menu. So I can just click on emission, and I can see that I'll be emitting some fuel and some smoke and some temperature. Perfect. That's all I need to get some fire going. But right now there is no simulation. So again, I need to drag from the emitter, and the only option here is to create a simulation node. Still nothing's showing up, so I'm gonna keep dragging. So from the volume, I need to create a volume processing node. And from that, I can create a scene node. Still, there's nothing showing up in my viewport, and that's because I need to create a shading node that will actually display all of these nodes, because the simulation flows from left to right. So it goes all the way here, and I need to display it somehow. So I'll just make a shading node, and now it tells me connect a lighting node to the shading node. So I still need a light in the scene. So I'll just drag out and make an ambient light. And now finally there is some fire in my scene. I can just hit spacebar to start the simulation, R to reset, and I have some very basic fire showing up in my scene. As you can see in the overall scene node, I also have an option here for a skybox, so I can move these shading and light nodes out of the way and just make a new skybox. But in order for the sky to show up, you need to give it a sun. So I'll just drag from the sun and make a new directional light. And now here's my sky. I can play with the sky light intensity, change it to uniform color or a shade. So I'll just leave it at atmosphere. And I can also give my scene some ground. So I'll just drag from the ground and make the default ground. Instead of grid, I can set it to just uniform color. Maybe make it just like a light gray. So I'll just change my shape type to be a torus, hit Q to move, and then move it slightly above the ground. And we need to add some noise so that this doesn't look like a candle almost. So from the forces in the simulation node, I'll just make a new force. So this is very close to the default simulation. The reason why the ground is blue is because under the light ambient, the inherent sky color is set to 100%, so you can just set it to 0%. We can maybe just set it to grid and increase the ambient intensity. And here you go. This is pretty much the default EmberG scene. So I just wanted to do this in front of you to start with a blank EmberG viewport. I have seen people asking for that, like how do we make something completely from scratch? Because sometimes it can be a bit actually confusing when you open EmberG. There's already a bunch of nodes here. So really these nodes back here will always be there. You always need a volume processing and you need a scene. You don't need a ground, but usually you're gonna have a ground. You don't need the sky. Usually I turn it off, but it's good to know how to set it up. And you're gonna always need the shading node to actually display what's here. Then from the scene node, you can go into the render node, and this is how you would actually export image sequences out. You would drag out of the VDB over here to export VDBs out of the volume processing node. And you would drag out of the particles in the simulation node to just export the particles. So there are 3 different ways to get stuff out of EmberG. So I'm actually just gonna reset this. So I'll just go to File, New Project, Don't Save. Right, so now you know how this is put together. We're gonna cover the fire gradients later in the course. We're gonna cover how to emit GPU particles and how to add different forces over here. But really, the important thing for you to know is that you can just always sort of mentally separate this. So throughout the course, you will see me open the default scene, And I will usually just either delete everything that's here and just set up the simulation part from scratch, or I will just delete all of these comments that they added because it's just a bit crowded over here and I don't need to see all that. And now you just have a clean scene that you can modify from here. Okay, so like I said in the previous video, when you open an EmberG scene, there's a bunch of stuff here that I don't really want. I prefer to start with a blank scene. So I ended up actually just creating my own blank scene template, and I would always start from that template. It just saves me that extra minute of time that it takes to delete all this and make a few changes that I prefer. So actually I'll just delete all of these emitters too and just keep the simulation node. I want to go into the skybox and you can turn off the sky, and I'll just make the ground uniform color, make it a slightly darker gray. And then what I like to do is just decrease the ground lid radius, and you can watch the horizon slowly shrink down until there's just a little bit of light around our simulation area. And what we can also do is go under simulation, and I don't want the simulation area to be as tall, so I'll just make it maybe 150, and then we can do 200 by 200 on the X and Y, apply new resolution. And I also want to delete the default gradient for the fire color because I will want to create my own. So I'll just delete that and drag from the fire color and make a new gradient. We're gonna cover all this, don't worry. This is just right now for us to make a default blank template scene, which is what this will be. And from now on, throughout the course, whenever we start from scratch, creating any of the effects, we're gonna start from this blank template. So I'll just go under File, Save As, and I'll just save this as blank scene. And now if I click on the home icon, my projects, I have my blank scene template over here. So now I'll just start with the blank template, go to File, Save As, and I'll just save it as simple fire _01. And so now we said we wanted to make a simple fire simulation. So I'll just make a new emitter, and it needs to be an emitter volume. That's what you will use for fire and smoke. For GPU particles, you will use emitter particles. So emitter volume, and once again, we need to give it something to be on fire. We need to give it a shape. So I'll just drag from the shape and make a new primitive, set the type to be a torus, reset the simulation, and here's my torus. I can just move this higher, but I can't see the torus right now. So we can do is go under emitter, visuals, show emitter. Now the fire is pure white because we have this default gradient which just goes from white to black. The right side over here is the hottest parts of the flame. The black side is the coldest side of the flame. So I can just play with these colors a little bit. I'm not gonna try to make anything amazing. This color wheel is pretty fun to play with. So first you will define basically the saturation, and then you can just drag to control the tone of the color or the shade. So I know I want to be in like orange hues, and then you can double click to make another point, maybe make it a bit more yellowish. And by playing with this gradient, you can create some very beautiful fire shaders. What I really want to show you is the emitter node. So first you have emitter activity, so you can turn it on and off. And under emission, you can control how much fire you actually get. So I can increase the fuel rate to get more and more fire. I can increase the smoke rate to get way more smoke, but it just sort of ends up suffocating the fire. And in order for fire to display properly, you need temperature, because fire is shaded by temperature. Again, this gradient beautifully shows you that the hottest parts of the flame, let's say we can make them blue, right? So the bottom of the flame where it's hottest is now blue. And then over time it gets colder. So maybe when it gets colder, it gets more green. And then when it gets really cold, maybe we can make it, let's say pink, just to make it super obvious how this works. So if you play with the sliders over here, you can beautifully control and display the different temperatures of the flame. So as I increase the temperature, you can see that more and more of the fire turns blue, because now more of the fire is in this hot range where it turns blue. While if I decrease the temperature lower and lower, now all of the fire is in the low temperature pink range over here. So that's how temperature works and affects the simulation. Also, the hotter something is, the faster it's rising up. So that's also something to keep in mind. So I'll just go back under visuals, uncheck show emitter. Now we removed the original color gradient, but what if you want to bring it back? Well, you actually have an option here to load and save color gradients. So I'll just save this scene and then just make a brand new scene over here with the default gradient, and I can click on save. And I'll just save it as default fire gradient. And then I can go back into the scene we were just working on, which is the simple fire, color gradient, load, and I can load in the default fire gradient, and here it is. So whenever you make a fire gradient that you're proud of, that looks really good, and you know that you're gonna want to reuse it in the future, you can always just save that gradient and then bring it back into every one of your projects. Super useful. Now just to finish going over the most important settings for the emitter, we went over the emission for the fuel, smoke, and temperature. Then you also have this additional pressure rate. So this essentially makes it more explosive. It's an easy way to animate explosions. If you just animate the pressure rate to be really high for just maybe a few frames, you can get a nice explosive effect. Now, a pro tip for you is that if you make it a negative value, it actually sucks all of the surrounding smoke to it. So this is a quick and easy way to get any kind of a suction effect, like maybe you're working on an air purifier, like a smoke alarm system that sucks in all the smoke, a stove, a fan, anything like that. You can easily attract smoke to an object just by setting the pressure rate to be a negative value. And you also have this pressure random intensity. So this just randomizes the explosiveness. So if I set this to 0, it's basically uniform all around. While if you increase the random intensity, you get a much more random emission. So I'll just hit R to reset, and I'm getting something like this. So I'll just set the additional pressure rate to be 0. And now, as you notice, as I move this around, the fire inherits the motion. So if I move it from left to right quickly, the fire keeps moving to the right. It inherits the velocity. So you can control that over here with the velocity transfer. If I just set this to 0, then the fire actually doesn't inherit any velocity. It's just sort of staying in place when I move it really fast. Well, if I set this to 200%, which is twice as fast, if I just move the torus a little bit, you see how the fire has velocity in the same direction as the torus. So this is an important setting to know and understand whenever you have objects moving and you want to control how they affect the simulation. You can play with the velocity transfer. So this is a pretty simple note, pretty self-explanatory settings. You're just controlling how much fuel you have, how much smoke you're generating, at what temperature. You can give it some explosiveness with the additional pressure rate, and you can control the velocity transfer. If, for example, you have an animated character, you can control how much velocity that character gives to the smoke that's coming out of him, for example. So in the next video, we're gonna focus on emitter particles. All right, one thing that I realized I need to address early is the speed of the simulation in your viewport. You cannot let this fool you, right? This is not the actual speed of the simulation. This is just how fast it's being rendered in the viewport for you. So right now on my graphics card, this is the speed that it's being rendered at. So if I do Shift S, you can see I have my simulation speed and my rendering speed. Now, if I'm, let's say, on an older graphics card, it will show up slower. So to demonstrate that, I will just set my upscaling here to, let's say, ×3. So my voxel count will go from 4.7 million to 127 million, right? So right now the simulation is taking 20 milliseconds, while before it was taking like 4 milliseconds. So it's being shown much slower in the viewport. However, when you export this, it will be the correct speed, no matter how fast or slow it's showing in your viewport. So just to demonstrate how this works, I exported two sequences. One sequence when it was moving at this speed without any upscaling, and then I exported the exact same 300 frames when I set the upscaling to ×3 when it's much slower in the viewport. However, when you import it into After Effects, both of those exports will move at the correct speed, right? This is something that is important to understand from the beginning, is that the speed at which the simulation is showing in your viewport is just a representation. So don't be fooled by how fast or slow it's showing in your viewport. This is entirely dependent on your graphics card. The only way to know for sure what the actual speed of the simulation is to make a preview by exporting in the render node. So this is something that's covered in the export import chapter later in the course. But I know that I need to address it early because I realize that some of you may be on a much older graphics card and you're watching this course and you're thinking, well, it's showing so fast for Jesse, why is it so slow for me? Right? So just remember that once you export it into After Effects, again, this sequence is with no upscaling, this sequence is with upscaling, and if I go to the last frame, it's the exact same simulation, except the upscaled one has more detail in the smoke. So that's just an important concept that is different from a traditional software. So just wrap your head around that, and we're gonna march forward in the next video. Okay, so this video will be an introduction to GPU particles. We are once again gonna start with our blank scene template that we created. If you're skipping around the course and you're not sure what I'm talking about, make sure you go back. I really am recording the course assuming that you are watching the videos in order. First, we need to once again create some kind of an emitter, and we're gonna use the emitter particles this time. And we still need to give it an object to emit the particles out of. So again, I'll make a shape primitive and change it to a torus. So with the particle emitter, it's showing me a nice outline of where the emitter actually is. So half of it is under the ground. So we need to, again, move it slightly above the ground. And if I hit R and spacebar, I have some particles being emitted. Now, as you'll notice, they are rising up pretty fast, but there's no fire and there's no temperature. So why are they rising up? I know that when I first started learning EmberG, and this took me a while to figure out, you actually need to go under the simulation node, force, and then set the buoyancy to 0. So buoyancy in this case is actually that one force that's making it rise up. So now they're not rising up anymore, but if I raise the emitter higher, they're actually falling down ever so slowly, and that's because of gravity. So under emitter, active forces, we need to set the gravity intensity to be 0 if we want them to be born in place and not go anywhere. And so now finally, if I reset the scene, the particles are being born in place and they die in place without going anywhere. And that's my preferred starting point when I'm setting up effects. I don't want there to be any default forces affecting anything unless I add them myself. So I'll just move this torus down back to the ground. So now that we have a blank slate, we can decide what we want to happen. So I want them to be rising up ever so slightly just to demonstrate some of these settings. So I'll go back under active forces and set the gravity intensity to be -5. And this will just make them start rising up very slowly. So what you notice right away is that they are born with full opacity. They flash, right? They very abruptly appear, but then they disappear very slowly. They slowly fade out. Their opacity is lowered to 0 over time as they die. So this is something that you can control under the rendering tab with the alpha attenuation over life. This just means that the alpha of the particles, or the opacity, will be lowered gradually as they reach the end of their lifetime. So if I want them to die as abruptly as they are born, I can just set the alpha attenuation to 0%. And I'll see them they maintain their full opacity for their whole life, and then they just die abruptly, going from 100% opacity to 0. Now I actually want them to be rising up a bit faster, so I'll just set the gravity intensity to -10. Now if we focus on their shape, they remain the same size the whole time. They are born at a certain size and then they die at the exact same size. But what if we want them to be born out of nothing, slowly get bigger, maintain their size, and then get small and disappear before they die? Well, we can do that in the shape tab. So here we have the size by life modulation, and I can make a new point here and a new point here, and I'll just drag this point all the way to 0 and the last point all the way to 0. And now what you'll notice is they are born completely from nothing, then they slowly get bigger, and then when they die, they get small before they die. And this is right now a linear point, so it's sharp, so I can just set it to be a cosine, and now I have a nice smooth curve for their size over life. So they're born small and they die small, and it's a much more soothing, sort of a pleasing to the eye effect to have the particles be born and die this way. So that's something that we're gonna do over and over again in this course. So I'll just extend the node details so I can see more of the settings at once. And let's take it from the top. So we have a continuous emission enabled. That means that the particles will just be continuously emitted at an emission rate of 125,000 particles per second. Now, if I hit Shift S, I actually have my current particle count. So right now I have around 460,000 particles in the scene at any given time. Of course, the number is changing because they are constantly being born and dying at random times. Now, if you're working on something like an explosion or a magic burst, you might just want one quick flash of particles instead of a continuous emission. So you can turn the continuous emission off and instead turn on the burst emission. So when you do that, a burst of particles, 1 million particles in this case, will be emitted for just that one frame in the beginning of the simulation. So if I hit R, all of the particles are born at once and then they slowly disappear. So that's what burst is for. So I'll just turn it off and turn on continuous again. Next, we have this emission style. Right now it's set to regular. You can set it to entangled. So this is something you can use to create lightning or lasers and all sorts of very interesting and cool effects. It essentially groups the particles together and creates these random lines. And the last emission style is clumped, which essentially creates these groups of particles that are emitted in random places. So I'll just set it to entangled again. So as you see right now, they're being emitted in these perfectly straight lines. So if you want to randomize their position, you can just increase the jitter distance. So you'll see as I keep increasing this, they're basically spreading out in all directions, and I'm getting much thicker lines, so to speak, right now. So this is a great way to randomize burst position of the particles when you're working on effects. So I'll just set it back to 0 and set the emission style back to regular. So there are other settings right now that I'm not gonna talk about because we're gonna touch on them as we go through the course and we work on the actual effects. That's gonna make it much easier for you to learn what these do. I just want to point out some of the most common ones that you'll be using over and over again. So definitely you'll be changing the lifetime of the particles. So right now the particles die anywhere after 3 to 4 seconds. I can move these points completely closer together, and now all of the particles will die after 4 seconds lifetime. Or I can extend the range and they will now live anywhere from 4 to, let's say, 8 seconds. And you can also click here and just change the number on your keyboard. So I'll just say 8. And you can also drag the whole range. So if you put the mouse in the middle of this range, you can actually drag the whole range instead of just moving these individual points. So it's a pretty handy tip. So I can make them stay alive for much longer. Initial forces, again, we're going to touch on later in the course. Active forces also we're going to use a lot, but right now the only setting that we're changing is the gravity. So if I keep decreasing the gravity, they keep rising up because it's negative gravity, or I can make it a positive gravity and they will start falling down. Now notice that they're actually colliding with the floor, and that's controlled with these collisions. So here we have ground bound, meaning that it bounces when it hits the ground. I can also say kill and they will instantly die when they touch the floor. Or I can say ignore and they will just fall right through the floor. So I'll just leave it at bounce and make the gravity negative again so they rise up. Inside of the shape settings you can make them bigger or smaller. So you can just make them pretty huge or very tiny. Same as with the lifetime, you have a range for their size. So you can have some very large particles and some very small particles being born together. and get some beautiful randomization. Almost looks like bokeh, sort of out of focus lights right now. Pretty cool. So I'll just reset it, hit R to reset. And finally, we have the rendering here. So right now the mode is set to lit. You can set it to emissive, which means that they will actually emit light, and set the blend type to additive. So they will be added on top of each other, or their intensity will be added on top of each other. So I can maybe go under emission and emit less particles, so it's not just pure white. So maybe let's try just 18,000 particles. And you can see that the floor is starting to get illuminated by them. So I can increase the emissive boost and they will create way more light. So this is a cool way to illuminate the smoke and add scattering into your smoke. If your smoke is too dark, for example, you can just give birth to a few particles. So for now, I just want to change the initial color, maybe set it to a nice blue. We're not going to worry about injection just yet. Just wanted to give you a complete introduction to the GPU particles. There are just a few main settings that you'll be using over and over again. So we will continue in the next video. Okay, picking this up right where we left off, we can hit B to hide the box brackets. And now, what if we wanted each particle to be a different color randomly? So I'll go under the rendering tab of my emitter particles. And here I have the initial color. Now this only allows me to change the color for all of the particles at once. But if I want to assign a random color, I need to expose the pin. So if you click once on this circle here, you're setting keyframes, and you see that it showed up on the timeline here. But we actually want to click again to enable the pin override. So if you noticed, the initial color now showed up in this node, and I'm allowed to plug something into the initial color. So I can drag from it, and I want to plug a color gradient into the initial color. So we have a gradient here going from pure white to pure black, but our particles are still blue. And that's because we need to change the initial color type from uniform color, which is just this pure blue, to a random per particle. And now you can see that each particle is born with a shade anywhere from pure black to pure white. So I'll just assign some random colors here to this gradient, maybe different shades of blue to make it look nice. So we can start maybe with this light blue, then we can do like a darker blue, then we can do almost purple-ish, then we can actually do almost like a white, and then maybe here we can do almost pure white, and in the end we can do absolute pure white. So now as you can see, the particles are randomly born with a color taken from this gradient, and it's looking pretty nice. However, this is still a gradient, so it's sampling these random colors. If I want these specific colors, I can just change the interpolation color space to be constant. And now I just get solid colors with no gradient between them. Now, because the emissive mode is set to additive, the particles appear white when they're on top of each other, because again, their intensity is being added on top of each other, right? So you can clearly see that in areas where there's more particles, it gets whiter. Now I can go back into the emitter rendering and just set this to be a lit mode with, let's say, translucent. And now I can see the different colors of the particles much more clearer. In the previous video, I was also referring to the particles going from 100% opacity to 0. They actually are at 80% opacity by default. So it's something I want to point out. You can, of course, change their opacity and make them much more transparent. So I'll just set this to maybe 10%. It's a bit hard to see, but they are much more transparent than they were before. If I just boost this all the way to 100, you can immediately see the difference in basically the strength of their color. They're much more opaque than they were before. So I'll just change the mode to emissive and blend type to additive again. And here you have this color attenuation over life. So if you hover over any of the settings, it actually gives you a tooltip of what it does. So it says color attenuation of the particles over their lifetime. 100% will make the particles go black at the end of their life. So as I raise this to 100%, you'll see that the color of the particles slowly fades to black before they die. So this is yet another way to have the particles die in a smooth way without sort of dying abruptly. I'll just reset it back to 0% where it was. Now a quick tip for you, a lot of the settings will actually update even when the simulation is paused, which is kind of strange, but it is awesome. So you can just pause the simulation, and for example, I can go to sharpness over here, and you'll see it update even though the simulation is not running. So sometimes the simulation running can be distracting, right? And you just sort of need to pause it and look at what's happening to the particles without them like moving out of the way. So here I can just change the sharpness, and you can see how the border of the particles gets completely sharp. And as I decrease the sharpness, they go back to their sort of blurry look that they have before. They sort of look out of focus, or they can just be perfect sharp circles this way. And finally, what I want to show you in this video is the injection. So the injection is an amazing way to create some very realistic fire and smoke effects with a lot of detail. It allows you to emit smoke and fire and temperature and fuel out of the individual GPU particles rather than just out of a whole object. So you can just make sure that the inject velocities is enabled. And now I can just start increasing the amount of smoke here. And you'll notice that there's no smoke being emitted out of the individual GPU particles. Maybe just do, let's say, 10% of smoke, just a little bit. And I want to go back to the rendering to show you the emissive boost. So as I lower the emissive boost, you'll see how the smoke is illuminated less and less. So this is what I was mentioning earlier. This is a great way to brighten up your smoke and add some light to your smoke. Now you can actually turn off render particles and the individual particles will disappear, but the light that they're injecting is still there. So I can turn off inject light and scattering and they will not contribute any scattering to the smoke, or I can turn it on to get this kind of an effect. So I'll just set the smoke to 0, reset again, and we can maybe just inject some fuel and some flames. Now of course we just have this black and white gradient plugged into our fire, so I'll just load our default fire gradient that we had saved in the previous lesson. And now you can see that the particles are actually emitting some flames and fuel. Now right now it's looking a bit frozen in place, and that's because the fire is not inheriting the velocity from the particles. So you can just set the velocity here to 100% instead of a 0%, and the fire will now actually be given velocity based on the particles themselves, right? So I'm starting to get something much more explosive and emissive over here. So with just a few clicks, I'm getting some really beautiful, very detailed fire just by injecting flames and fuel into the GPU particles and increasing the velocity to 100%. Now it's freaking out a little bit right now because the particles themselves are affected by the fire and the temperature. So they're sort of stuck in this loop where they create temperature and then the temperature affects them and it repeats. And so it just starts sort of freaking out a little bit. And I will explain how all of that works in the next video. Okay, so in this video, we're going to combine the GPU particles with our regular volume emitter and advect the particles with the smoke and fire. You'll see what I mean. It's very cool. Now I am in my blank scene and I just want to set the buoyancy to be 0 always in our blank scene. So I'll just save that. And you can download this blank scene. It's included with the course, so just download it so you can start in the exact same spot that I am. So I'll just save as and save it as both emitters together. And now we can start by creating our GPU particles emitter. So we can just drag out a new emitter particles. And then from the shape, we need to give it a shape primitive. And I want to make it a torus. And I'll just move the torus slightly higher up. And now I also want to make a volume emitter. So I'll just make a new emitter here, make an emitter volume. And I also want to give it a shape primitive. And I'll just leave that as a sphere. So now if I just reset and start the simulation, you can see that my GPU particles are falling down under the force of gravity. And because there's no buoyancy, everything is just sort of stuck in place. So I'll just go back into my emitter particles, active forces, and same as before, I'll just set the gravity to 0. So now the GPU particles should be perfectly in place, and yet there is a slight turbulence inside of them. And that's because they are already being affected by the forces created by the fire and the smoke over here. There is temperature being created that's rising up, which is advecting the GPU particles to slightly move around. So I want to make this a bit more obvious. So first we can go to the emitter volume, visuals, show emitter, reset, and I just want to move this sphere just to the side and shape. Let's make the radius much smaller because I want it to be super obvious how this works. I only want the fire to influence a small piece of the torus. And so now I can just reset the simulation and watch what happens. As I move this emitter volume higher, it's producing fire, temperature, and smoke. I'm giving it velocity by moving it around, and it's dragging those particles with itself. It's advecting the particles. So I can go into the emitter and maybe increase the fuel rate to make this a bit more obvious and give it maybe some additional pressure rate. Now you can see how I'm beautifully taking the particles along with the fire. So I'll just reset these values again. So now we can go into the emitter for the particles, active forces. This volume setting is actually what controls how much the particles are controlled by the volume, by the fire. So this really should be called advection. I'm not sure why it's called volume. Volume doesn't really mean anything. What we're really doing is we're advecting the particles with the fire and the smoke. So watch what happens when I set this all the way to 0 and I reset the simulation, grab my emitter here. No matter what I do, I'm not affecting the particles at all. Now if I go back here and I set the volume all the way to 100 or set the advection all the way to 100%, now when I reset the simulation and move this around, the particles are now 100% adhering to the forces created by the fire and the smoke. So I'm getting these beautiful particle plumes going all the way up as they're doing their absolute best to stay stuck to the fire and the smoke. So to make this a bit cooler, maybe I can go into the emitter particles emission and just increase the emission rate way higher. So let's give ourselves maybe 1 million particles. So that's 1 and 6 zeros. Reset the simulation, grab this emitter, and now I can just play around with this, and I have these beautiful plumes of particles being advected by the fire. You can see they're also beautifully colliding with the floor still. Super cool. By the way, the collisions with the floor, you can enable and disable under simulation solid ground. So if I turn off solid ground, now what you'll see is the fire will just die as soon as it touches the floor. There's no collisions. This is enabled by default, by the way, so you don't have to worry about it, but I just want you to know that it's there. So I also want to show you how this works on a slightly different example. So what we can do is go under simulation and set the buoyancy to maybe 5%. So now everything should be rising up pretty slowly. So I'll just block the fire into the same torus as the particles. So just put it in here. And they're not born in the exact same place right now, and that's just because the position here is moved. So you can just zero out the position for the emitter volume, and so now both emitters are in the exact same spot. So if I reset, I have some fire being created out of the torus, and it's taking all of the particles with it. So I can just change the shape here to be a sphere, maybe make it a bit smaller and move it lower, reset, and we can just go under emitter volume, visuals, show emitter, turn off. And now you have some beautiful GPU particles being advected by the fire. What you can do is go into the volume emission, and we can just turn off the fuel emission and only keep the smoke. And then what you can do is go under simulation, combustion, and increase the smoke dissipation all the way to 100. And basically what you're left with is just GPU particles which are advected by the smoke. So now you can just move this sphere around and you're getting some beautiful plumes of particles being created without any smoke or fire. However, you would never be able to get this kind of a beautiful smoky, behavior of the particles without this volume emitter being there as well. So this is obviously very, very fun to play around with right now. As always, the project file is included with the course, so feel free to open this up and play around with it. And we're gonna see how we can add some cool colors and modify this even more in the next video. Alright, one thing I didn't address earlier are these injection curves. So it pretty much does exactly what you would expect. It fades the injection amount over the life of the particle. So as the particle is coming to the end of its life, if I set this to the default curve, it will gradually emit less and less fuel until it dies. So you can see if I start playing with, let's say, the flames, if you pay attention to what's happening over here, right, I'm controlling the amount. You can see how if you pay attention to the end of their life up here, as I'm bringing it down, it just fades out. And if I bring it up, I bring it to sort of full opacity out here. So this is just a nicer way to fade out the emission of the smoke, fire, or flames as your particles are slowly dying off. If I set both of these to 0 and reset, then there's nothing coming out. Right, because right now the flames are completely faded for the whole duration of their life. Now if I move this point to 100, then it's at full 100% emission at the beginning of the life of the particle, and then it slowly fades over the lifetime of the particle. So you see I'm getting these nice sort of transitions into nothing. And if I erase both of these points all the way to 100, then it's at 100% emission for the whole duration of the particle. So I'm just getting the same thickness of these trails for the whole time. So throughout the course, we're pretty much just gonna leave it at default, but I do want you to know how this works because it obviously can be useful. Okay, so we have this pretty cool basic setup of some particles being advected by the smoke. And now we can start combining what we've learned so far to make this look a bit cooler. So under simulation force, I'll just set the buoyancy back to 0 so it's not going up anymore. And instead I would kind of like it to behave like dry ice or it's just heavy smoke. So I'll increase the smoke weight to maybe 100% of gravity, and you'll see it will slowly start falling down. Now we can go into the emitter volume emission. I'll just set the temperature to no emission, and we can increase the smoke rate to generate more smoke. So now we have more smoke that's heavy, falling down, hitting the floor. So it's gonna start looking almost like ink in water. Gonna get some beautiful sort of heavy plumes happening. So now what we can do is improve how the particles are looking. So under shape, we can do that size by life attenuation. So I'll just make those 2 points and drag it down so that they get small before they die. And they also are small before they're born. And I'll just set this to be a cosine, which is a curve. In the beginning, it can be a pretty sharp curve, and in the end, it can just slowly get small and die. I think I'll also increase the particle sharpness just a little bit. You can always pause the simulation, zoom in, increase the sharpness to see what kind of an effect it's having, and I will make them a bit smaller. So maybe 50%. I really like how they're colliding with the floor, so maybe they can just stay alive a bit longer. So under life, we've gone over this as well. I'm going to just click in the middle of the range so I can drag the whole range forward, just like this. And so now they will stay alive for much longer. Now my simulation is visibly slowing down because I now have 8 million particles in the scene at any given time. So back under emission, you can just set the emission rate to maybe half. So let's do 500,000 particles, reset, and that should speed it up. If you are on an older GPU, feel free to just lower it even more just so that it's real time and fast for you while we're just setting up these simple examples. So the next thing I would like to do is give them a color depending on how fast they're moving. So we can go under rendering, initial color type, and I'll just set that to velocity based. We can just set the initial color to be pure white because we're going to change the color over time or modulate it. That's what modulation means. So if you hover over modulation color, it says it's used to modulate the color of the particles over time. Perfect. That's what we need. So instead of uniform color modulation, I want to say modulate over speed. And then it says expose the modulation color to use non-uniform color. So this pure white is a uniform color, and we want to use a non-uniform color, meaning a gradient, for example. So whenever it says expose, it means click twice, right? Click once to make a keyframe, click a second time to expose the parameter, meaning that it showed up in the node over here. So now I can drag from the modulation color and plug something else into it. And I want to use a color gradient, and it's basically working already. I can tell that the particles that are the fastest are more in the white colors, where the slowest particles are pure black. So now what you can do is just start playing around with this gradient to give it some nice colors that you're after. So maybe the faster they're moving, the more bright, let's say orange they will be. And then the slower they're moving, they will maybe be, pure red. Just move that over here. Get rid of the pure black, maybe just make it like a dark red color. And then we can maybe make a yellow color in here, maybe a pure yellow. And I'll just go back into the settings over here. Let's set the opacity to be 100%. And now you can play with the modulation speed limits. Now watch what happens as I drag this range lower. I'm basically shifting the mapping over speed. So at this point, the particles are allowed to be slower and slower and slower before they start turning yellow, right? Because on our gradient, the fastest particles are orange. So let's just switch that. I want the fastest particles to be pure yellow. And then when they're slower, they can be a more orange color. Then they can be even more orange until they're basically the slowest, which is red. So now we have this beautiful gradient going from the fastest particles to the slowest. Now if I extend this range, they will be shifting over on the spectrum to the left side. So they're now darker and darker red until they're all completely dark red, or I can make them all completely pure yellow. So that's how you control the mapping of the colors. Now you can also flip the modulation gradient. So now the fastest particles are dark red and the slowest particles are pure yellow. I actually kind of really like that look, so I think I'm gonna keep it flipped, but I just want you to be aware that this setting is here. Now, if let's say you don't like this gradient, you can just copy, paste. You can change the colors over here to different hues. So I will just keep basically rotating the wheel. I'm just changing the color itself. So I'm going into darker blue and then an even darker blue and an even darker blue until I'm almost in pure black territory over here. And I can just double click to unlink this orange gradient and link my blue gradient over here. And I have something like this, which is pretty nice too. Now we may end up using these again, so same as before, I'll just click save and save this as my basic orange gradient, and I'll save this one as my basic blue gradient, just because they may come in handy. Another setting I want to show you is the particles occlusion. So right now they occlude the light and they're creating shadows. So you can see it's visibly dark where there's a lot of particles. So if I decrease the particle occlusion, you can see it gets much brighter everywhere because they're not casting any shadows. So I'll just crank that up, and you can actually go beyond 100%, right? So don't forget that. A lot of times the ranges don't stop at 100. So I'll just reset it back to 100. And just like with everything else, I would encourage you to experiment. So particle type, we can set to emissive, set it to additive, maybe lower the emissive boost, and you have just some nice sort of magical glowing wispy particles going around. And you can of course just grab the emitter. You can sort of tell that they're outside of their range. They're moving a bit too fast. So what you can do is go over here again into the range and just extend the range. And now if I move it, we should see some nicer colors show up right away. Awesome. So this is really beautiful. I have to say it's so addictive to play with this in real time and just watch it update in front of your eyes, especially after years of running simulations the old-fashioned way. This is just amazing. I mean, look at that. So far I have had to move the emitter manually to get some nice blooms to show up, but in the next video I'll show you how to use modulators for this to happen automatically. Alright, so like I said in the previous video, so far we've had to move this emitter manually to get something cool to happen, but we can actually use modulators to give some random movement to this emitter on its own. So as always, you can either right click and just go under modulators and select the one that you're looking for, or you can just drag from the object itself, but first you need to expose that parameter. So like we've learned, you can just click twice on any of these parameters that have the circle in there. First click is keyframe, second click is to expose the position parameter in here. So now I can drag from it and plug something into it. And I'll just use the modulator oscillator. So right now it's shooting around like crazy, like a bullet. And that's just because these values are way too high. So first we can actually just set it to a random noise instead of sine. Sine just means these uniform waves, but we want it to be a random movement. So I'll just set it to noise on all axes, and I'm just sort of shooting across the entire box back and forth. So I'll just set the base here to 0, and the frequency, let's try maybe 0.2 on all axes, and I'll set the amount to maybe just, let's try 20%. Alright, it's still going outside of the bounds of our box. The amount I'll just set to maybe 5% each, and the frequency, let's just try 0.1. Okay, so now it seems to be staying within the bounds of our box. It's just a bit too slow, and I would like it to be a bit higher. So the base is, where it starts. So I can just increase this to 7 meters so that it's a bit higher up inside of the box. Maybe let's try 8 meters. And the amount, let's try 10%. So that moves around a bit more. Okay, maybe that's too much. So final number, I'll just do 7%. And the frequency is how fast it's moving and changing direction. So let's try 0.2. Alright, so this is not bad, but the emitter seems to be going from just that one corner back to this one. So I'll just increase the frequency on the X and Y to maybe 0.3. And this should make it more going to the left and right instead of just, top to bottom as well. Maybe you might have to randomize the numbers a little bit. Okay, now we're starting to get something pretty interesting. Awesome. So the smoke is inheriting the velocity from the emitter pretty strongly. So we can go back into the emitter volume. And like we've learned, the velocity transfers the velocity from the emitter onto the smoke. So if I set this to 0, I'm basically going to be creating a trail behind my emitter. While if I set it to 200%, then the smoke will be twice as fast as the emitter itself. I'm going to get something way more violent. So I think I'll settle at around maybe 75%. So now we can just play with the color over speed. So in the emitter particles rendering, you can increase the range for the speed limit, and this makes the smoke more visible right away. So the modulators are nothing to be afraid of. There are several kinds of them. We're going to go over some of the other types throughout the course and set up some cool effects with them. It's really just a way to automate or randomize movements, values. You can plug these oscillators into almost any value that is allowed to be exposed. So you can randomize the amount of fuel or smoke. You can randomize the pressure rate to get some explosiveness and some sort of random explosions, right? There's so much that you can do. You have different types of the waveforms over here. So we've seen the sine one, which just makes some uniform waves. Then you have random noise, you have pulse. You can also do custom and draw your own, which we're also gonna do later in the course. Just to recap the settings, the base is where it starts on frame 0. So it starts 8 meters above the ground and in the middle of the simulation area. That's why X and Y are 0. The frequency here is how often it changes direction, or in other words, how crazy this curve is. So if I increase the frequency, you can see that the curve has so many more sort of spikes and points on it, and our emitter is completely freaking out. So I'll just do Control Z to go back to where it was. You can change the phase of the oscillator. So if you don't like where it starts, you can just sort of randomize these values so that it starts in a different place. I'll just again reset these to 0. And then you have the amount. So this would be how much it's moving around. So as I increase the amount, you can see that the graph curve over here is reaching higher or lower. And as I lowered it, the curve flattens almost to a perfect flat line. So again, I'll do Control Z to go back to where we were. And the attenuation is sort of like an overall multiplier, like a global multiplier. So if I'll set this to 200%, it doubles the values for everything. So now it's much crazier. If I set it to just 50%, it halves all of the values. So now it's much slower. I actually kind of like the slower effect. So maybe we can do 60% and leave it there. So there's obviously an infinite amount of possibilities when it comes to the oscillators, because you can modify them so much. You have different types of oscillators and you can plug them into all of these values. So just as a random example to demonstrate, we can affect the smoke rate, or how much smoke is being emitted, with an oscillator as well. So I'll double click to expose my smoke rate, drag out to make an oscillator. As you can see, what's happening, it's sort of flashing because it's either emitting 0 or it's emitting 200%. You can watch the smoke rate change over here. So I can slow down the frequency to maybe just 0.1. And now what's happening is the amount of smoke emitted is slowly changing over time from 0 to the full value of 250% right now, and then back to 0. So I'll just delete this. I just wanted to show you that it is possible to put these oscillators into almost anything. I'll change our smoke rate back to 65 where it was, and we will continue with another example in the next video. Alright, so in this video I want to talk about forces. I'm once again starting with my blank scene. So I'll just make a new volume emitter and a new shape primitive, R, and here we go. I'm going to set the buoyancy to 20%, or maybe let's just do 10%, and I don't want any fuel. So emitter emission, I'll just set the fuel rate or fuel emission to no emission, and I just have some smoke rising upwards. It's still going up too fast, so maybe just 5% buoyancy. So now I want to break up this smoke with some noise. So I have two options here, and it's important to understand the difference. You can either plug a noise into the emitter itself, or you can add a force to the entire simulator box. And I want you to see the difference. So first, I'll just drag out a new force from the emitter and just add a noise. It's too strong, so we can just reduce the amplitude here to maybe just 0.5. What's happening right now, the noise is being applied to just the emitter, meaning if the noise is off, it's completely flat or around the sides of the sphere. Now, if I enable the noise is being applied, but only where the smoke is born, right around the emitter. It's no longer being affected by the noise up here or anywhere else in the simulator. It's only being affected by the noise right here where our emitter sphere is. If, on the other hand, I plug this noise into the simulation node, then the noise is being applied to the entire simulation box. There is noise being applied everywhere, not just around the emitter, but everywhere in the box. So the smoke up here is being affected and up here. So I get a much noisier result, right? Because there's just noise being applied everywhere. Just to show you the difference, I'll plug it just into the emitter one more time. And now you can see the smoke gets gradually smoother and smoother as it's rising up, because it's not being affected by any noise up here. It's only being affected down here. So right now we are using the noise force. Again, you can right click, force, and here are all of the forces that are available to you to use. The noise force has a whole bunch of settings over here. The main ones that you're going to be using over and over again really are the amplitude, which is the strength of the noise. So as I increase this, I get a much stronger result, and also the animation speed. So as I decrease the animation speed, the noise is changing slower and slower. So it's still the same strength because of the amplitude, it's just not animated as fast. So usually when I'm changing the noise, I will be changing the amplitude, the animation speed, and I will be changing the scale. So watch what happens. As I increase the scale, I'm getting much bigger sort of waves, because here in the preview I can see that the noise is simply much larger. If on the other hand I just lower the scale lower and lower, I'm getting some very fine, very small detailed noise affecting the smoke. So we are going to be using the noise force all throughout the course for almost everything. So we will keep going over these additional settings. The main three settings that I just want you to know and understand right now is the scale, the amplitude, and the animation speed. Those are the three ones that you need to get started. So now I can maybe change the color of the smoke. We haven't touched the shading node at all, and we're gonna spend a lot of time here, but for now we can just go under smoke and change the minimum and maximum color to be just a bit brighter. And now we can add another force on top of this force. So you can just go into the simulation node, drag out, and add a line force. By default, this is pushing everything up with the push strength of 1, which is actually really high. So I'll just set it to 0. Just like with everything else in EmberG, because there's no punishment for changing values, unlike in traditional software, you change your value, you have to run the simulation, change the value, run it again. It's so fast to see, what everything does, that a great way to learn is simply for you to just mess around with these settings a little bit and see for yourself how it affects your simulations. I can just show you, for example, the twist strength just makes it, spin and twist around. Then you can maybe add a little bit of push to push it up as it's spinning, and you can easily start creating something like tornado effects this way. Maybe it's spinning too fast. It's all about balance, and these values are pretty sensitive. So, something maybe like 0.3, 0.4. Let's do 0.3 here. And we have some smoke affected by noise, but also affected by this force. I can go back into my emitter, enable my fuel emission, set it to add. And now I have some fuel being emitted. I can increase the fuel rate. And now I'm starting to get something like a crazy fire tornado, right? Because why not? So I'll just turn it off for now. I'm just playing around. But this is what it's all about. Don't be afraid to just have fun with the software and see what changing the settings will do for you. So just to go over this a little bit more, you have the repel strength, which will push everything away from that line force. So if I increase this, it's gonna push everything to the side of the simulator. Don't forget that with a lot of these values, you can go into the negative. And negative means here that it's gonna attract everything to the line. So as I go more and more negative, it's trying to get closer and closer to the line itself. And you can also grab this line, hit W to rotate, and just start rotating it around and see how it messes everything up and affects the simulation. So we're gonna have a lot of fun as we start setting up all of the different projects that I've prepared for this course. We're gonna be using all of the forces. Really just wanted to show you the absolute basics and make sure that you understand the difference between adding a force to just the emitter and adding a force to the entire simulator box and what kind of a difference it makes. And we're gonna continue in the next video. Alright, so in this example I want to demonstrate how force masking works. So I just have two simple sphere emitters with some smoke going up, and I have some noise in the scene. So at this point we understand that if I plug the noise into this emitter, it will only affect that emitter. If I plug it into this one, it will only affect this emitter, and if I plug it into the simulation node, it will affect everything inside of the simulator with that noise. Now, I also have this primitive box over here. And what if I want this noise force to only affect the smoke that's inside of this box? Well, first what I need to do is let me hide the box. I'll move the force up here and just connect it to our simulation node. So again, it's affecting everything. But you see I have this mask shapes input. I can plug something into it. So I'll just connect the mask shape to my shape emitter. Now I can't really see what's happening, and it looks like it's being affected by noise down here instead of up here. So I need to go into the force and say show force mask. And actually the box is showing up down here, and that's the area that's being affected by the noise. So somehow I need to move this mask box higher up where I want it to be. But if I keep moving the force, nothing happens. So for that we need to enable this tether mask shapes. Tether is just another word for link. So this will link the mask shape to the force transform. Meaning if I enable this, I can now move the mask box along with the force. And I can confirm now that all of the smoke that's inside of the box is now being affected by the noise. I can turn off show mask force so I don't see the green box. And I can see that it's working beautifully. Now I can just move the box to the other emitter, and I can confirm that now all of the smoke that's inside of the box on this side is being affected. So I'll just move it back over here, and I can, now do everything that I'm used to doing. I can increase the amplitude for the noise or decrease it, and I can do this for all of the other forces as well. So I can, make a line force, make it twist, make it do whatever I want it to do with all of these forces. And I can use this mask shapes option to only have the force affect a certain area. This is extremely useful, as you can imagine, for all sorts of effects where you simply want to isolate the force to just a desired area. Now, of course, I can say show mask force, and I can change the primitive to anything I want. So maybe I want a sphere instead, or I want any other shape, and it will still work. By the way, if you just do an emitter import, we're gonna do this later in the course where we will import our own geometry, and you can also use your own geometry as a mask for the force. This works, this will connect. So if you have your own geometry that you want here, that will work as well. Just want you to know that. So there's another way to include or exclude what the force affects or doesn't affect. And for that, I've added a third emitter, which just emits some particles. Like we've learned, I set the volume for the particles to be 0 so that the particles are not affected by the smoke at all. That's why they're just going up in a completely straight line. And if I enable the noise right now, you can see that the noise is affecting everything that's inside of the box, both the smoke and the particles. So if I hide the box, this is what's happening right now. The emitter on the left is not affected because it's not inside of the green box. Now, if I set the mode up here to just affect the particles, then as you can see, the smoke on the right is just not affected anymore. It's only the particles that are affected. I can set this to volume, and now only the smoke will be affected while the GPU particles remain intact. Or I can set this to volume and particles, which is what it's at by default, and it will affect both. So I hope that you're catching this. I know that this is not the most exciting example, but it's the most obvious way to demonstrate how this works, and I promise you this will be useful to you when you get to setting up some cool effects. You will always want to find a way for the force to only affect what you want it to affect. So being able to set up these shapes and include or exclude different types of emitters from being affected is hugely helpful. And the last way to include or exclude what's being affected by the force is if you scroll down in any force, you have this masking tab. Now the word masking may be implying like you're drawing a mask like you would in After Effects. That's not what it means. It really means more just include or exclude what is or isn't affected by the force. That's how I say it in my head instead of masking. So the constant mask here just means like a global multiplier. So let me just hide the shape. So if I set the constant mask to 0, then nothing is affected by the noise anymore. If I set it to 100%, then it's being affected by these values that I've set, the way I see them. If I set it to 200%, it's like a global multiplier that just doubles the speed force by 2, right? So you can increase this further, you can do 300%. By the way, by default, 100% is the maximum, but you can actually set this to 500%, and now the bar sort of changes and you can go from 0 to 500. To change that, you can just click on these 3 dots. We haven't done that yet. So if you click on this, it lets you define the range that you can be within. So I can set it from -100 as a minimum to 100 as the maximum. And now, the bar is full at 100%, but you can override it manually again and just set it to 500%. And you can go back here and say reset bounce, and it will switch back to what it started with, which is -100 to 100. Just want you to be aware, right? So this can be useful if you don't want to mess with the individual values. You just want to maybe lower the strength of the noise all at once. You can just lower this value. And then you have 3 different masks: velocity, temperature, and smoke. So this just means that the noise will only be applied to a smoke that's moving above a certain speed. This will be difficult to see in this example, so you'll just have to trust me. But basically, this just means that the noise is only applied to the fast particles, or to particles that have a certain temperature, or to a certain density of smoke. So basically you can say, hey EmberG, wherever the smoke is the most dense, I want it to be broken up with noise. And you would increase this value to only break up the densest smoke. To be honest, I very rarely use this. I almost never use this. I can see how it could possibly be useful. I just haven't used it for anything yet. The most I would use maybe is this constant mask. But just to make this lesson complete, I want you to be aware that these masking options are here as well. And we will continue in the next video. All right, so there are just a few more important settings that I want to touch on with the simulation node. So right now there is no noise in the scene, and yet there's visibly some vorticity affecting our smoke. So I want you to know that to turn it off, you can go under simulation, vorticity, and by default, the vorticity intensity is set to 5%. If you set it to 0, you will get that completely flat smoke that's not affected by anything. So like I was saying earlier, sometimes when you're troubleshooting, it's good to start with a completely clean slate and know what exactly is affecting your smoke. So right now I know that it's completely flat and I can just increase the vorticity to whatever number I'm after to get the look that I personally want. Now, similar to the previous video where we talked about the masking, this works the same way. So the constant mask is basically a global multiplier. If I set this to 100%, I will get much more intensity in the vorticity. And I can also make the vorticity affect just the smoke or just the temperature or just the smoke that's moving at a certain speed, right? This means that the faster the smoke is moving, the more it's affected by velocity. That's why you can see here the smoke is basically flat in the beginning, and then the faster it's moving as it's rising up, it's more broken up by the vorticity over time. I also want to touch on the combustion tab. We already played with the smoke dissipation. So if I set this to 100%, it kills all of the smoke almost instantly. If I set it to 0%, then none of the smoke is dissipating. It only gets killed when it reaches the border. So this is something that you'll be using a lot all the time. Now, if I go to this fire emitter, I'm emitting smoke, but I can also just say no emission for the smoke, so that I'm only emitting fuel, and yet there's still smoke in the scene. And that's because we have this generated smoke set to 15%. This means that as combustion occurs and the fuel burns, it will generate smoke on its own. So if I set this to 0, Now finally we're getting no smoke. So this is another one of those sort of gotcha settings that you have to know about. You might be setting the smoke emission to 0 or nothing and still wonder, why is there smoke in my scene? It's because the fuel is generating its own smoke. So you can just increase this to get smoke this way. The flame intensity, let me just show you. Right, as I increase this, I'm basically giving more strength to the flame, and the expansion works a similar way. So some of these settings are very similar to each other. To be honest, I don't really touch flame intensity or expansion. If I wanted to expand, I will just go into the emitter and give it more additional pressure. And this is sort of my preferred way to get like an explosion to happen, is by injecting some additional pressure into it. But again, just want you to know that these flame intensity and expansion settings are here as well. Buoyancy we covered, right? The more buoyancy, the faster it rises up. Smoke weight we also played with. The higher this value, the heavier the smoke. And you can sort of get like a dry ice look this way, or maybe a magical orb, just like what I'm getting right now. Not too bad. You can achieve almost the same effect by reversing the gravity multiplier here. So if I set it to negative values, it will push everything downwards, including the fire. So this smoke weight only affects the smoke, the gravity affects everything, right? So now everything's being pushed down as I reverse the gravity. Well, just to show you the difference, if I just increase the smoke weight, basically the fire is still doing its best to go up, while it's only the generated smoke that's going down. So it's a slightly different effect. Then you have some wind force that you can add here. To be honest, I don't use this. I will just add a line force and then rotate it and maybe just lower the push strength to get the effect of a wind this way if I really need that. Shredding we're gonna play with later on. There are some settings that we haven't touched on yet. Simulation size, I'm gonna spend some time on that and explain, as well as looping and time control. So don't worry, we're gonna eventually cover basically everything that's here throughout the course. Just wanna give you the basics so that you can move forward with setting up the projects with me in a bit. This masking here, this is actually more like feather in After Effects. Watch what happens as I increase the intensity. And watch the border, especially here where the smoke is getting killed at the border of the box. As I increase the mask distance and increase the intensity, I'm basically masking out the edges of the simulator. And I'm using a sphere shape for that. I can also use a box or a cylinder. But this is a great way to hide that the smoke is getting clipped, especially if you're working on flip books and you need it to be borderless, right? You can just very easily feather out the edges and get rid of this annoying line where it's so visibly getting cut off. So this is a very useful feature that I definitely want you to know about and use. So that's it for this lesson. Just wanted to cover the combustion, the vorticity, and the generation of the smoke, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, so we're gonna spend a little bit of time talking about the simulation size and the importance of scene scale. Because if you are completely new to simulations in general, your scene scale is very important. Because if you're working on a big rocket launch or just a small campfire, you need to set up your scene scale correctly, otherwise your simulations will not look correct. Right, you can't have a very small scale simulation for something like a rocket launch. You have to adjust the size of everything accordingly. So for this car burning simulation that we will set up completely from scratch later in the course, I had to adjust the simulation area to be much larger in order for this fire to look like it is actually a large scale fire. Otherwise it just looked wrong. It just looked like a tiny fire inside of a big car. So inside of the simulation node, this is an area that we haven't touched on yet. Basically, this simulation grid that we've been seeing is made out of voxels. A voxel is a 3-dimensional pixel. So the screen that you're watching this video right now is made of pixels because it's in just 2 dimensions. It's just X and Y. In 3D, we have the Z dimension, and that's why they're called voxels. So I made this quick example in 3ds Max where let's pretend that this green box is our simulation box in EmberG, right? So this cube is a representation of a voxel. The entire simulation grid is made out of individual voxels, even though you can't see them. But right now my voxel size is 0.2 meters per voxel, and I have 250 by 128 by 150 voxels in my scene. So EmberG will adjust the numbers a little bit for them to fit nicely. And so my current total voxel count is 5.24 million voxels. That's what I'm simulating right now inside of this grid, right? So I have a row of voxels going on the x-axis, a row going on the y-axis, and a row going on the z-axis. To make it more obvious, I'm gonna jump into a blank scene example. So here I am back in our blank scene. I just have a sphere on fire. And now what I wanna do is make this box bigger to accommodate this smoke rising up, right? So up until this point, we haven't touched the size of the simulation area. So what I will do is just go into my simulation node, and I know I want it to be bigger on the z-axis, and this is where these gizmos come in handy because you know which axis you're looking at. So up is z, so I know that I need to extend it on the z-axis. Maybe I'll set this to 200, enter, and then you need to click apply new resolution, and the simulation area is now taller. However, I'm simulating more voxels than I was before. So I'm at 11 million voxels. If I set this to just 100 on the Z, I'm only simulating 6.4 million voxels. That's a huge difference, right? So this is something to keep in mind, that the simulation can very quickly slow down if you just start increasing the size of this simulation box. So generally what you want to do is keep the simulation box as tight and close to your effect as possible without anything getting clipped. So I know that I'm simulating a whole bunch of empty space right here, even though my simulation only takes place in the middle. So what I can do actually is just shrink it on the X and Y. So I'll just do 100 on the X, 100 on the Y, and 200 on the Z. And I should be getting this tall, thin simulator box, which is perfect. Nothing is getting clipped on the sides. I'm getting plenty of room up top for the smoke to do its thing. Now, another important thing is scale. So how big really is this sphere? Is it as big as a car? Is it as small as a teacup? Is it as big as a volcano? You don't really know until you figure out basically the units inside of EmberG. So what you can do is go into the ground node and set this to grid, so you can see the actual grid. And here it tells you ground material scale, it's 0.5 meter per tile. So just to make it more easy to understand, I will make it 1 meter per tile. So right now, one of these tiles, the small tiles over here, not the big one of these small tiles is 1 meter by 1 meter. And to confirm 100% that this is true, I have made a box that is 1 meter long in 3ds Max, exported it as an FBX, imported into EmberG, and here is my 1 meter box perfectly fitting into that tile. So I can confirm that each tile in EmberG right now is 1 meter by 1 meter, meaning one of these big tiles is 10 meters by 10 meters. So actually this sphere is pretty huge when you think about it. This sphere is taking over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, around 6 meters, maybe 5 to 6 meters in diameter. So this sphere is as big as a car, right? While in the beginning you might think that it's a small sort of tiny simulation of something being fired on your desk, maybe. So that's why this matters. You need to know how big things are before you start setting up some effects that are meant to be realistic. So if I want to do a helicopter on fire, I know that a helicopter maybe is around 15 meters tall. And so I will know now that I need to check if the scale of the helicopter is correct in EmberG by checking with these tiles to make sure. So the helicopter should take over about 1.5 of these big tiles and 15 of the small tiles. So you might think, okay, that makes sense, but what about if I want to do a huge simulation of, let's say, a volcano that is 50 meters in diameter? Well, your first instinct might be, I need to make my simulation box much bigger. And you might do something like set this to 400 by 400 by, let's say, 300, apply a new resolution, but you quickly find out that your simulation is now extremely slow. And that's because you're simulating 55 million voxels, which is a huge amount, right? So no amount of graphics card power will save you at this point. The simulation will be slow because you're simulating such a huge amount of voxels. So the only way out of this problem is to make each voxel bigger. Because as I was saying, if you make each voxel bigger, then less voxels will fit into the simulations. However, the voxels will take over a much larger area, right? So right now I have 9 voxels. Let me make it 10, right? So if each voxel is a meter, I am now taking over a simulation that's 10 meters long. However, if each voxel is very small, then I'm maybe only simulating an area that's 1 meter long. So what we need to do in this case is go back to where we were, which was 100 by 100 by 200 voxels. The voxel count is correct. It's the voxel size that's the problem here. We simply need the voxel size to be much larger to get a much larger scale simulation. So I will actually set the voxel size to 0.5 meters, apply new resolution, and I will get a huge simulation box right now, right? So if each of these big tiles is 10 meters, then right now this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is 60 by 60 meters. That's starting to be almost the size of a small crater, if you would. Now I can make it even bigger. I can just make the voxel size 1 meter and I'll get a much bigger box this way. So now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12. So that's 120 by 120 meters. And it's even much taller than that, right? So this is a huge simulation grid at this point, right? So now I need to go into my simulation settings here and start tweaking this to get that large scale look. So I need to increase the radius of the sphere. I need to maybe go into the simulation tab, force, and decrease the buoyancy to maybe just 0. Or even less, like 0.1, right? Because this is supposed to be a huge large scale fire. I may need to play with the noise. So I'll just set the noise amplitude to just 0.05, reset the simulation. And I'm slowly starting to get something that looks large scale, right? It's not magically gonna look good just because you made the simulation grid bigger. You still have to go in and tweak all the settings to get the large scale look, but at least you know that the grid is the correct size. So I just loaded up the volcano preset to show you that this is what Jenga Effects did too. They increased the voxel size to 0.5 meters. So they're simulating around 56 million voxels in this preset. And if I go into the ground and just say, you know, display grid, make this 1 meter per tile like what we did, you can see that everything is exactly as I just explained to you. Each tile here is 1 meter. So each big tile is 10 meters. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this is 70 by 70 meters, which is perfect for a large scale volcano eruption. So I'll just go back to my example here that I created. I hope that this is making sense. There really is nothing particularly complicated about it. You just have to keep in mind that, okay, I need to make my simulation grid as big as it should be to accommodate the simulation that I'm working on. So if I'm working on a burning car, it can only be maybe just like, 10 by 10 meters. But if I'm working on a volcano, so I know that I'm gonna need to increase my voxel size for a huge simulation and increase my voxel count as much as I can without slowing the scene down to a halt. Usually it takes a little bit of back and forth to find the right numbers over here for something that, is simulating fast but also looks good at the same time. But luckily the feedback in EmberG is so fast that with just a little bit of tweaking and that instant real-time feedback, you can quickly find a great value for the voxel size and the voxel count. So if this is confusing to you, don't worry about it. This was just an introductory lesson. we are gonna adjust the simulation size for pretty much every single project inside of this course. So there's gonna be plenty of this over and over again. So don't worry, you will understand this completely by the time you're done with this course. I just wanted to give you a brief introduction and explain what a voxel is and how the simulation works behind the scenes, right? That it's made up of individual voxels. And the more voxels you have, the more resolution you have, but the slower the simulation is. So I'll see you in the next video for more. Okay, so one of the main nodes we haven't talked about yet is the shading node. So inside of the shading nodes, there are 7 main categories. Now, we are still in the introductory chapter of this course, so don't try to necessarily remember all of these settings. I just want you to have a general awareness of, okay, when I'm done setting up my simulation, I'm okay with the amount of smoke and the amount of fire that I'm getting. Then we will move into the shading node where we can tweak the look of everything. So here you can tweak the lighting, the scattering, meaning the light that's going through the smoke and lighting it up. So if I increase the direct light contribution for the scattering, there's now more light allowed through the smoke, and it's making the smoke look lighter and wispier instead of thick and heavy. Same thing with the lighting. We can increase the shadow intensity of the smoke to make it look much darker as the shadows get more opaque. So you get some much thicker appearing smoke this way. Next we have emissive masking. So the fire is emitting light and that light is going through the smoke. So if I turn this off, it just darkens everything because there's no emissive light coming out of the fire. And finally, here's the flame stab. So this is what we've been using with the gradient. So the reason why we're even able to use a color gradient is because the flames coloring here is set to be exposed color gradient. So just like we covered before, by default, this can just be set to maybe a random color ramp. So you can have just one solid color for the fire that you can change like this. But you can get a much more realistic look if you plug in your own color gradient like we have been doing. So you have color ramp, you also have black body shader, which you might be used to from other software. You can also get some very nice realistic fire shading this way. And then you can say exposed color gradient, which will automatically set this to be that pin override. The fire color shows up here and I can plug my fire color into my color gradient. The main few settings I would use in here are mainly the shaping by flames, which just nicely brightens up the flames or darkens them. Flames density limit, which also will basically cut the flames depending on their density. So you can increase or decrease the amount of flames in your scene. And you have the coloring remap range. So similar to the GPU particles lesson where we were coloring the particles by speed and we were changing the range of at which speed are the particles which color, you're doing the same thing here with the temperature. So you're changing at which temperature is the fire which color depending on the gradient. So as I'm moving this range around, the coloring of the flames is changing depending on their temperature and depending on that gradient that we have created. And you have the same thing here for the smoke. So you can do either a single color for the smoke and just have one solid color to control all of the smoke. Or you can do a color ramp, which gives you minimum color and maximum color, and it will create a gradient between the two colors. So if I change this to red and change this to blue, you see how that works. And you can change the coloring remap range, similar to the flames, to control how the smoke is colored with these two colors and the gradient. As I decrease the range, I'm introducing more of that red color. As I increase it, I'm introducing more of the blue color. This is not a bad abstract sort of motion design look, by the way, but usually what you would do is just give yourself like a gray standard smoke and then maybe introduce a little bit of a brighter gray to the edges of the smoke. So maybe the first color can be almost pure black, and then you would introduce some lighter gray to the edges. And it just sort of brings out the detail because the nice wispy smoke around the edges is brighter. Now, a lot of times you will want the smoke to appear thicker. So for that, you can just increase the smoke density scale and get much thicker appearing smoke this way. Or if you want to just cut out some of that very thin smoke along the edges, you can increase the smoke density limit. And this basically removes the smoke based on the density. So the least dense smoke is being removed and only the most dense smoke remains. So as I increase this, I'm slowly cutting out all of the smoke until there's nothing left. But this is just a nice quick way to get rid of some of this maybe messy sort of smoke along the edges. So I can maybe set it to 4% and get sort of a clean smoke trail this way. So from what I've seen online, the main thing about EmberG that intimidates people who are new to it is that there are seemingly so many settings, but really there are only a few key settings that you need to get started and start creating some very cool effects. You know, don't feel like you need to understand what every single setting does. That's something that comes with time and with experimentation. There are just a few main settings, such as the color and the density for the flames, color and the density for the smoke. Then you can just make the smoke a bit darker with the scattering and the lighting. Very simple settings. So I would say don't be intimidated by the sheer amount of settings here. Try to simplify it in your head. And as we go through the projects, and we will go through this workflow over and over again of, we will always set up an emitter, add some forces, then go into the shading node, change the colors, change the density. You will very quickly realize that this is actually a pretty simple software and there's nothing to be afraid of. So this was just a quick introduction to the shading node, and we will continue in the next video. Alright, so after you're happy with your simulation and your shading, the color of everything, you can apply some post-processed effects to really bring out some detail, add some sharpening, and also apply some post effects. So if I just pause the simulation right now, we have this ray march sharpening. This is a new feature that was introduced in the 1.0 version of EmberG. This is a completely new way to sharpen your simulations. It's enabled by default. So just to show you, this is what it looks like without the sharpening. I'm gonna zoom in, turn it on, turn it off. Right, so it's a huge difference in the perceived detail and the sharpness of the smoke. You can go up to 500% over here for the sharpening. I'm at around 400% right now. And you can also apply the same sharpening to the flames and to the temperature, but usually you will just use this for the smoke. So you can see that really without it, I'm getting some very sort of blurry appearing smoke. So this makes a huge difference. So I'll set it back to 400%. Then you also have the older sharpening that only used to be available before 1.0 came out, which is in the volume processing node. Under volume post process, you can enable sharpen. So again, this is before with just the ray march sharpening, and this is after. So now we have two sharpening effects being applied on top of each other. If I run the simulation, I'm getting some very sharp smoke. It's almost starting to be a bit too much at this point, right? So it's definitely a balance. But I just want you to know that there are two different ways to sharpen your smoke, right? So first is the shading node, rendering, ray march sharpening. The second is the volume processing, and you set it to sharpen. Another very useful one here is the dilation one. So as I lower this, I'm basically gonna get this very thin wispy smoke, but I have a better example for that. So here I have another example which we will set up later in the course of just some heavy but very thin detailed smoke. And the way to achieve this look is just to go into the volume processing and set the volume process to dilate. And then you need to make the dilation value negative to basically only get the edges of the smoke to appear so nicely. So as I decrease the dilation lower and lower, I'm just getting these nice sort of outlines of the smoke, making it look very sort of small scale, cigarette smoke, all that. So again, this is before, just regular sort of thick smoke. And this is after. So a huge difference. And the last available post process here is motion blur. So as I crank this up, you can see we're getting some nice motion blur on the fastest moving parts of the fire. And this value is animatable too. So for example, you could animate the motion blur to only be active for the first few frames of your explosion. So when the explosion is moving the fastest, there's motion blur to it. And then as it slows down, the motion blur also goes away gradually. And finally, there's the scene node, which we also haven't touched yet. That's sort of the final touches node, your color correction, your vignette, some stylized effects, color correction effects that you may be used to from After Effects Premiere. You can increase or decrease the exposure, and this affects the entire scene, not just the simulation, but everything around it. So if I enable the skybox, you can see that as I'm increasing the exposure, I'm increasing it for everything, including the sky. You have your color vibrance. You can play with some different HDR tone mapping modes to get some completely different looks. Brightness, saturation, contrast. I think you get how all this works. A good setting to use is the bloom intensity and radius. So this is sort of like adding glow. In After Effects, you can control the bloom intensity and the bloom radius to increase basically the glow around your simulation. Then you have your vignetting. This is hard to see because we actually kind of already have a vignette because of the way the ground is set up. You can just increase the offset for the vignette to introduce some vignetting in the corners of your simulation. You can crank up the intensity, crank up the roundness, and basically get that same look as I was getting with the ground. And finally, you have this style tab. I feel like a lot of people are overlooking this and not really using it, but there are some very cool sort of stylized effects that you can use to make some very unique effects. So I would encourage you to just click through these and see what they do. This one sort of makes it look like a painting, high contrast strokes, right? And then of course, each one comes with its own set of settings. So you can crank this up just to get some nice outlines of the simulation. Super cool. So I would say this whole scene node is especially useful when you're just recording your screen. You want to show off your work on social media and you don't want to necessarily export anything. Usually you would maybe export into After Effects and add some contrast, add some saturation to make it prettier, but you can do all of that right within EmberG and then just record your screen. So just to recap, you have your sharpening inside of the shading node. Then you also have some sharpening, dilation, and motion blur in your post-processing node. And you have some post effects and color correction in your scene node. So that's these three over here. And we will continue in the next video. Okay, so EmberG has a pretty simple lighting system. It's definitely not as high quality as a full render with global illumination in like 3ds Max or Cinema 4D. However, I think a lot of times people will set up a cool simulation, but they don't spend that extra 5 to 10 minutes adding a few lights to really make it stand out. And I think it's really worth it because there are some cool light types in EmberG that really help take it to the next level visually. So just to show you, I'm going to lower the intensity of this light back down to where I had it, and I'll enable all of these additional lights that I've added. This only took a few minutes to do. And you see that immediately I'm getting something that has so much more visual flair. I have some nice back lighting with this blue light, some nice warm light coming from the front, and just a few lights over here indicating sort of street lamps. And it takes the effect from looking pretty basic to looking pretty cinematic, I think. So we've touched on almost everything that is in this creation menu for EmberG. We haven't talked about lights yet. So you have 4 different light types. We have this point light, which if I select it, that's just basically a light bulb, omnidirectional, which makes light in all directions. You have some basic settings such as the color, the size of the light bulb or the sphere, so to speak, and the light intensity. Then you have the spotlight, which I love to use because this basically gives you this directional cone, creating, if I just move it, right, it creates this kind of a, almost like an IES light if you've used that in V-Ray. And the reason I like to use it is because if you just rotate it, you can easily illuminate just the smoke without illuminating the floor. And you can get some nice sort of a rim sort of back light this way. Then you have the ambient light, which is sort of like your environment global light. Increase the intensity, I'm sort of brightening up everything in my scene. And then you have the direction light, which works like a sun. So that's just this strong light coming from the side. I can change the azimuth, which is the direction of the light, the elevation, how high up in the sky it is, light intensity, light color. Pretty simple. Really just want you to be aware that these lights are here and it's worth using them and knowing how to use them, especially the spotlight. You can very quickly and easily add some very nice additional sort of detail to your simulations just by brightening up the edges, playing with the elevation of this light. The cone angle you can change, right? So how much it spreads the light around. This penumbra angle basically just means sharpness. So as I increase this, I'm blurring that light. As I decrease it, I'm making that light sharper and sharper, right? So actually there's more power to the lights than it seems. And if you just play around with them for 10 minutes after you're done with your simulation, you'll have that much more impact when you present your work to the world. So far, we've only used the primitives as our emitter, which meant we went into shape, primitive, and we plugged that into our emitter. And then we changed the type from sphere to, let's say, box, torus, tube, ellipsoid, just simple geometry. However, there are other types of emitters that I want you to know about. So if you right click shape, you have burst, particles, noise, transform, blend, modifier. These are very useful for all sorts of effects. So I want you to know that they're here and have a basic idea of how they work. So if I just connect the burst over here, you can see what that does. It just bursts basically a group of particles, and you can control the amount of these particles that you're getting. You can control the emission type, so either a single burst or a repeated burst. I'll just set it to repeated, and I can control how often it repeats. So now if I reset my simulation and start again, you can see they will be continuously being emitted. I think you're starting to see how this could be very useful for so many different effects. So I can increase the interval, I can increase how long they're being born for. So right now they're being born from the center to the outsides radially. You can change all that. You can change their radius, their size, their shape from spheres to, let's say, rings or spikes. The rings looked interesting, right? So I'm definitely imagining some shock waves being created this way. The next shape type I want to show you is the noise, and the noise is best used with the blend. So actually I'll just create a shape blend first, and this blend shape allows you to blend two different shapes together. So for my shape A, I can say a primitive and maybe just leave it as a sphere. And for my shape B, I'm gonna be cutting out shape A with the shape B. So I can say noise, and now what you see is if I increase the scale of this noise, I'm basically cutting shape A, which is the sphere, with the noise. And you can actually add some animation to this, and you have some nice animated noise, volumetric noise cutting out this sphere. And I can easily change this to be, let's say, a box, and you can use this on other imported geometry as well. So it doesn't have to be a noise for shape B, it can just be another primitive. So right now it's set to smooth intersection. You can also set it to morph, which is pretty cool. And you could animate the weight of the morph, and this way you will morph one object from the other. So I think you can imagine maybe a human face being on fire, and you morph it into a skull, like it's like the skin is burning away. That could be super cool. So I can just, move the sphere in the middle of the cube, and now I'm getting some nice morph between the cube and the sphere. And of course I can just change the shapes to anything I want. So I can just make this a torus and it will still morph beautifully. I can set this to, let's say, subtraction, set this to a rounded box. And now when I move the sphere, I'm cutting the rounded box with the sphere. So I think you get how this blend shape works. Very useful, very cool. Next, you can give birth to a burst of particles that look just like this. So this is very useful for any kind of trails, meteors, explosion, debris. Whenever you need some nice particles to emit a trail of smoke or fire, You can of course increase the burst size so you have way more particles. We can increase their life range to the maximum here of 5 seconds. And then if you go under collisions, and we can say collisions with the Z minus ground, which is the floor, we can set it to collide. And now they will collide and bounce off the floor. You can control how much they bounce with the bounciness, how much friction they have, or how much energy they lose when they collide. So I can set the bounciness much lower and they will just bounce a little bit and then stop. Again, instead of single burst, I can set it to continuous, and I'm continuously giving birth to some bouncing particles. I can increase the speed scale so that they shoot up higher, and all sorts of other settings. A lot of these are pretty self-explanatory and they make a lot of sense. So minimum, maximum speed, gravity, of course, the size range for these balls, so I can make them all much smaller. Another shape that I want you to know about is this modifier. So if I pluck a shape primitive and make it a rounded box, or let's just make it a regular box so that it's sharp, and it's going into my modifier shape, I can control the roundness of this shape. So as I increase this, you see it's getting more and more rounded instead of being a sharp box, which was in the beginning. I can also set this to golf ball. So this is better used if you just set the shape primitive to be a sphere. And now if I increase the amplitude, I'm basically getting these golf ball holes inside of my geometry. I can increase or decrease the frequency. So I can definitely see how this could be used for motion design effects. But also a lot of times when you have an object on fire, adding some holes to the object and add more detail to the fire, because it's not just a completely flat surface. And finally you have this invert option, which just inverts the geometry. So everything is filled with geometry except for the ball itself. So if I just increase the radius of this, you can see how that works, right? Basically everything is geometry except for the sphere because it's inverted. And finally you have your import node. So this is how you would import your own geometry. We're gonna do that soon. Import our own FBX and play around with all of the settings that come with that. Alright, so the last major feature I want to cover in this introductory chapter is the timeline and animation. So animation in EmberG is very intuitive, very easy, very fun, nothing to be worried about. We're just going to animate this sphere to move. So first I need to tell EmberG that I want to start setting some keyframes. So I want to select the setting that I want to animate, and for me it's going to be position. So I need to click on this circle over here. It gives me this little diamond and it showed up in my timeline. So I can just rename this as my sphere and the name will show up in the timeline over here. I know I want to animate it on the x-axis, that's the red arrow. So the way it works is you can either double click to make a keyframe or you can hold shift. It will give you a little ghost of the keyframe that will be created, and then you can just click once to make a keyframe. So again, that's either double click or shift click to make a keyframe. And let's say I want the first and the last keyframe to be the same, and then in the middle I will shift click again to make a new keyframe here. You can click the arrows on your keyboard to switch between the keyframe. So I'm just hitting my left arrow or my right arrow to switch between the individual keyframes. And here I'll just drag the value over to move the sphere to the right. And now if I run my simulation, the sphere goes quickly from left to right and back where it started. So I'll just extend this so that it's a bit slower. Hit R to reset, and it just goes back and forth. Now, what if I want this loop to continue? I want it to continuously going back and forth. Well, you have this loop icon here, or it's the shortcut L. So I can just hit L to enable that. And now I have the range, which will be looping. So I'll extend the range back to the end of my timeline here where the last keyframe is. And now if I hit R and spacebar to start the simulation, you see it will go back. So it's not exactly looping in the exact sense of the word loop. We're gonna cover actual simulation looping where, the smoke will look the same on the first and last frame, so that it will loop flawlessly. This is more of a repeating way, right? So the simulation will reset to frame 0 and continue to go in this range over and over again. That's really what this means in this particular case. So now I have the ball just going back and forth over and over. Now when I'm inside of my timeline, I can hold shift and scroll to go forward or backward on my timeline. I can hold control and scroll to zoom in and out on my timeline. So again, that's shift scroll to move and control scroll to zoom in and out. And you can also drag this big bar area over here. If you just click here and drag, you can quickly scroll through your timeline this way. If you want to select multiple keyframes at once, you can either hold control and click to select them individually, or you can just click and drag to select all of them at once like this, and you can move them all at once. So right now, as you're noticing, there is a curve applied to the keyframes, meaning the ball slows down and speeds up gradually because it's a Bezier keyframe. So if I right click on the keyframe, interpolation mode, it's set to Bezier. I can select all of them, right click and set the interpolation mode to linear. So it will be a hard keyframe. And now if I go forward, you can see that it just immediately bounces off without any smooth curve or transition to it. So I can also set it to smooth and you can see what that will do. But I'll just go back and set it to Bezier. Now, if I wanted to control this curve manually, I can just select the keyframe that I want to and click on the curve editor. And here is my keyframe. This is probably something you're used to from other software. You can just easily move these handles to control the curve of the keyframe, extend the curve, shrink the curve. Same as before, control and scroll to zoom in onto the keyframe, or shift and scroll to move on the timeline. You can also hold your middle mouse button to just pan, right? So that's middle mouse button, click and hold to pan on the timeline. And just to show you, if I make this interpolation mode linear, then here is my sharp keyframe, right? So I can just set the interpolation mode back to Bezier, and I have the Bezier handles on both sides. Like I said, switching between the individual keyframes is right or left arrow, or you can just click over here, go to previous key, go to next key, or play the simulation. So we have set the keyframes manually ourselves, but actually auto key is enabled by default. So if I click this, it means that auto key is disabled. I can click again to enable auto key, or I can just hit A to toggle it on and off. So this means that I can just move the object and it will automatically set a keyframe, or 3 keyframes in this case, for X, Y, and Z automatically. So if I just move the timeline indicator to, let's say, frame 320 and move this higher, it will create keyframes for me. So now it goes up and then it goes down again and it repeats. So this is something that you may be used to from After Effects, where you are used to just, changing the value and it will automatically create the keyframes for you. Or you can turn this off, and then no matter what you do, no keyframe is created until you create it manually by holding shift and clicking to make a new keyframe. Like I said, everything that has this circle next to it means that it can be animated. So I can go back here, I can animate the rotation, I can animate the radius, you can animate the activity of an emitter, turn things on and off. The possibilities here are endless. Alright, so this will be the final video in this introductory chapter. If you watched all of the previous 20 videos, then you have a solid base from which you can follow me in the following chapter, which will be project based, and we will start creating complete effect setups from start to finish, and we will be going over additional settings as we do so. There are 2 tabs that I haven't showed you yet, the favorites tab and the timeline tab. So you might have noticed that there is a star next to every setting in EmberG. So for example, we said that the buoyancy setting is something that we keep going back to. So I can just star it, and now it will show up in my favorites tab so I can easily access it. So if there are any settings that you constantly keep coming back to, it can get time consuming and annoying. So you can just star them and then you can easily find them all in the favorites tab. So I'll just make a new emitter volume, and make a new shape primitive. And I know that I will be changing the fuel rate all the time, the smoke rate, maybe the additional pressure rate. And now I have all of those settings inside of the favorites tab. Very, very useful. The next tab here is the timeline. So we talked about animation in the previous video. The same thing here. If you just set keyframes to some of these, so maybe I'm animating the fuel rate, smoke rate, additional pressure rate, and I'm animating the buoyancy. Now I can just go to the timeline tab, and all of the settings that have a keyframe enabled are now in my timeline tab. So I can easily find all the settings that have any kind of animation to them. So this is a quick way to filter and find whatever you're currently working on. I also want you to know that there is a search feature up here. So if you know that you're looking for buoyancy, but you're not sure which tab it's at and you're tired of scrolling, you can always just search and just type BU, here's buoyancy. So that's also useful. And you can also click on this diamond over here, and this says show timeline controlled parameters only. So this will only show you the parameters that have any kind of an animation enabled to them. So it's just a very quick filter option. It's basically the same as clicking on the timeline tab. And the last feature up here that I want you to know about is this randomize all seed parameters. So a lot of these shapes, particles, they have a seed option. So if I just make a new shape burst, here it says random seed. So you can randomize how they're being ejected from that starting point. If I change the seed, then they will fly out slightly differently, right? So you can just click on this randomize everything, and it will randomize the seed for you for all of the parameters. So this is a very quick way to get different looking results, which are similar but not the same, right? So if you're working on, let's say, clouds, and you just need to quickly generate 10 different types of clouds which look about the same but just slightly different, you can just with one click randomize all of the seeds for all of the settings which offer a random seed setting. It will change this number for you and you'll get a different looking simulation. So before we wrap this up, I want to give you a summary of everything that we've learned so far. I think at this point you understand that everything in EmberG flows from left to right. You will usually start with some kind of an emitter. We've gone over all of the different types of emitters, from primitives, particles, noise, the blend shape. So from the shape, we go into the emitter. We have covered the volume emitter, which is the standard emitter for smoke and fire. And then we also have the particle emitter to create GPU particles. The particle emitter needs to be plugged into emitters, and then the simulation node has to be plugged into the scene node. Here it goes from particles to particles in order for your GPU particles to show up. So we know how to emit particles and volumes. We have gone over the simulation tab. We've talked about the simulation size and how to make your simulations large scale. We have also covered the different types of lights, how to color your smoke and flames inside of the shading tab, how to add sharpening to your simulations with the Rainmart sharpening or with the volume post-process sharpening, dilation and motion blur, which we've covered, and then some color correction as a last touch with the scene node. So we have some exposure, saturation, and some stylized effects over here. So really when you break it down, I hope at this point none of this is intimidating or seems too complicated to you. All of these nodes should be making sense at this point. If anything is still a bit unclear, don't worry about it, just follow along with the course. Like I said, we're gonna keep going over these settings over and over again as we set up the projects. So I'll see you in the next chapter.